Namaste. Welcome to the Festival of Bharat Season 4. I'm your host Kamal Madishetty. Today we have with us a very special guest who's one of the most articulate voices on civilizational issues and dharmic affairs. He's the co-founder of Pragyata, a journal of Indic ideas, and Upward, which is a knowledge platform that focuses on civilizational issues. We have with us Ashish Dharji. Namaste Ashish ji. Welcome to the Festival of Bharat.
Thank you, Kamal. Thank you for having me on your show, and it's a pleasure to be here again.
Absolutely, Ashish ji. It is our pleasure to welcome you back at the Festival of Bharat. Thank you so much for joining us. And Ashish ji, first of all, I would like to ask you, how have you been doing in these difficult times of the pandemic? How has your work been?
Well, the work has been quite all right. I mean, in the sense that since my first appearance on this platform, a lot of water has flown under the bridge, and you've already introduced me with, associating my name with Pragyata and Upward. So Upward was started after the first season when I attended the Festival of Bharat, and I'm also involved in the Indie Collective Trust. I'm the operations manager, and you have already mentioned Pragyata. So at Upward, we've been doing a lot of video content, and we've taken up a few issues that we are kind of deep diving into, specifically to do with the freedom of temples movement and things like uh, you know the idea of democracy and exploring alternatives or better ways of governing our nation, stuff like that. People things that people take for granted. So Upward, we are trying to push into the direction of a discourse building platform. We've also diversified and started a couple of new brands like Chakshu and Unroll, and I'm glad that you've also been a contributor to some of the videos, and you've done some brilliant scripts. So thank you for that. And other than that, we've gotten into this new space, which is the Uprising app. It's basically a knowledge and information app. It's an information dissemination platform as opposed to a social media platform, where again the focus is on discourse building, civilizational discourse building. Other than that, I've been involved in this project on writing a book writing project called which has to do with the Indian idea of caste, right? It's a very contentious topic, and I've gotten into a lot of Twitter fights over this, and been dragged into and called many names. But hopefully, when the book comes out, a lot of those things will get clarified. And yeah, I mean, so a lot of stuff has happened between when I first came to Festival of Bharat and today.
Ashish ji, you are one of the most vocal and dedicated voices who speaks on civilizational issues, especially to a young audience. And I want to begin this conversation by asking you, if I may, about your own life journey. How did you discover this path? And are there any life experiences or influences in your life that you could share with us?
Um, I would like to clarify that I didn't discover any path, uh, but if I may say so, the path discovered me because it just happened, and I hadn't planned any of this. In fact, I was happily employed in the automotive and management consulting field, and but one fine day, I just decided that I'll do something on my own, which was just a hunch. And a few years later, the Pragyata happened, which was totally a coincidental thing. And I did not really have much idea um, about the sheer helplessness that a lot of our scholars were feeling, or perhaps still are, uh, in that they're being left alone by the Indian state, and they're working in silos, and their dedication and their devotion to their field of study has not really uh, brought them much happiness outside of just the fact that they are content with what they have been doing, other than giving them that contentment. in terms of material benefits, in terms of recognition, in terms of impact. A lot of that, uh, we discovered that they were in a very, tragic sort of position. So anyway, so I mean, coming back to the question, so I didn't really plan any of that out. But yeah, I mean, if you could say that there was something which was pushing me in that direction, that perhaps I could attribute it to my exile consciousness, in the fact that I was, just about 9 or 10 years old when we were kicked out of Kashmir, and that stayed with me. Uh, I suppose that stayed with a lot of people, but somehow I think I got more, in connect with it, and that may have influenced some of the decisions that I took. And finally, the just this idea of doing something for the civilization in whatever small way possible. I think perhaps it could come from that consciousness. But once I jumped into this field, what really kept me engaged was the fact that a lot of people felt that resonance with whatever I spoke and whatever I wrote. And that I thought was an indication of shared consciousness, right? So I had a consciousness of exile, and I had assumed that it was just me. But when I interacted with a lot of people, I found that even without being kicked out of their places of stay, or their native indigenous homelands, they still managed to have that feeling of exile. And that gave me an idea that it's not necessary that you need to be kicked out or you need to physically be in exile. You could also mentally be exiled. And yeah, so that's been something that has really kind of helped me to frame my thoughts and to work more towards, uh, in whatever ways we can, towards building or the civilizational resurgence that we are all involved in.
Thank you so much, Ashish ji, for sharing that. I think it's a very inspiring journey, and we are grateful that for the work that you do for the service of Dharma. So I want to ask you about something that you've spoken about in the past on several occasions, and that is the history of Kashmir. And I know this is a broad question, but for the benefit of our viewers, including some of our Western audience, could you share your thoughts on the history of Kashmir? Particularly Kashmir's place in our civilization, and also how over the centuries things changed in Kashmir.
So one of the most detailed talks that I've given about this, about the history of Kashmir, is with the Center for Indic Studies at Indus University. And uh, and when I shared with them the brief outline of what I wanted to say, so they came up with this very good title, and they said that let's title the talk as Kashmir from Kashyap to Kafir, right? So that's essentially, I mean, that beautifully captures the whole history of Kashmir, uh, from being the land of Kashyap Rishi, and the crown of the Indian Hindu civilization. It has now, become a place which refuses to identify. The majority of the people in Kashmir refuse to identify with India, right? So that's a fact that we cannot wish away. Um, it is, I mean, it was once the land of great scholars and great sages like Abhinav Gupta or Kshemendra or Utpaladev. And today, when we think of Kashmir, we think of it as a land of conflict and terrorism. So that's the transformation that has happened over a period of 600 years, roughly. And it's the most tragic story that could ever be told about a beautiful and a a place of sublime beauty, in fact. Um, so from the let's say the 14th century to now, Kashmir has undergone a dramatic demographic inversion from being 100% Hindu land, totally connected to the civilization of India, to becoming an almost 100% Muslim land. And I don't mean Muslim in a derogatory sense, but purely in terms of the statistics, right? So that's how the demographics have changed. Uh, and and in these 600 years, Kashmir has been the bleeding edge of the Indian civilization. And why bleeding edge? Because a lot of blood has actually flown on the streets of Kashmir, right? So the soil of Kashmir itself is drenched in blood, much like other places in North India, which bore the brunt of Islamic invasion, the medieval Islamic invasion. But Kashmir was really at the forefront, right? So it faced some of the worst times, some of the worst atrocities, and some of the worst tyrants happened to rule the land. And in these 600 years, uh, a lot of the culture, the heritage that was built over thousands of years and that had a continuity was destroyed. The material heritage itself, the way of thinking, ways of life, and my community somehow uh, remained unconverted, right? We continue to be Hindu. We continue to hold on to our traditions, our religion, our rituals. But the price we paid for that was, of course, blood and and seven distinct, separate exoduses that happened over the course of this 600 years. So, mm, mm, I personally was kicked out of Kashmir in 1990, along with 500,000 other Kashmiri Hindus, and this was the seventh exodus, not the first. Um, so, so that's the kind of that's the tragic story of Kashmir in a nutshell. And today, Kashmir remains territorially with India, but we need to reclaim its civilization.
Ashiji, having discussed this, now I want to ask you a question which sort of sounds a bit too simplistic and maybe optimistic as well. But I think it's an important question for us to ask, and I would want to ask nevertheless. And that is, how can dharma prevail in Kashmir once again? And if so, how can we do that?
Right. So, um, like I was mentioning, that this demographic inversion that happened in Kashmir, it didn't happen overnight, right? It happened over a long course of 600 years, and that kind of indicates that it is not a problem that can be solved by short-term thinking. So it needs a multi-generational response. It needs uh, it needs the government, the state, the Indian state, to think uh, quite far ahead, and that can only happen if the state accepts its civilizational responsibility, if it does not shy away from the fact that, these days the civilizational and the word civilization has become a buzzword now, at least in the circles that we speak in and are a part of. But notwithstanding that, the trivialization of the word, but it does have a very important import, which is to say that if you do not think of yourself as a civilization, then the only claim that you can make on Kashmir is territorial. And that territorial claim does not hold water because, all said and done, the people of the valley, uh, going by the principle of self determination, they will always uh, choose religious allegiance to this some sort of a nationalistic uh, allegiance, or allegiance based on a national identity, right? And that's pretty much the case. So unless you have a long-term plan of say a 50, 100 years, as a nation, where you are headed, what is the vision that you have, what kind of a society that you want to build, and who are your friends, who are your enemies, what kind of alliances do you have internationally. If you don't have that clarity, and if those alliances and those friends and enemies are based on something which is very short term, let's say something like a crisis that is impending. A lot of people frame the Kashmir problem as a problem of water, that India will have a water shortage, and therefore they need to, and all this conflict is because of water. So that's a gross reductionism. That's like saying that the only thing that matters, you can't solve the water problem by talking to your neighbors. It's as simple as that. But somehow we shy away from looking at the Kashmir problem, the Kashmir conflict, as a religious civilizational conflict, and the responsibility for that is the propaganda. It goes. I mean, the responsibility for that is of the Indian state and its propaganda machinery, which has created all sorts of misconceptions among the citizens of India about Kashmir, because they are unwilling to acknowledge the civilizational dimension of this problem and to face it bravely. And the problem is actually on account of the nature of the Indian state. It's a democratic republic, right? And all all the parties that come to power, they are only looking at the problem from a perspective of a 5-year window. This is what we have to manage, and then we'll see the next 5 years, right? So a problem that has evolved over 600 years is sought to be solved by not short term but micro short term thinking, like 5 years के period में सोचते हो आप. So when that happens, then obviously there is going to be no solution. So to establish a dharmic civilization again in Kashmir would require what I had argued in one of the videos on Upward as an infinite game approach, where you are no longer playing for small, trivial victories and for media headlines, but you have a long term. This is another way of saying the same thing, that you have a long term victory inside in mind, and you're playing the game to continue the game to increase your dominance from 1 year to the next and over several generations. So as far as the state is concerned, they have their task cut out before them, and they have no choice but to think long term. How they will do that, I don't know, but that's the least that they could do if they really are serious about retaining the hold on Kashmir. But as citizens and as Hindus, I think that the the least that we can do to bring back dharma in Kashmir is to become dharmic in a certain sense, right? And that would mean that we reconnect with our tradition. Uh, if we say that this is a civilizational battle, if we say that the root of the Kashmir problem is the religious conflict, which it is, and which the other side openly acknowledges, then I think that we should also learn from the adversary, that they do not look at the problem as some sort of a political problem, although that rhetoric is there in the media. That's what they say in the media. But if you go onto the streets of the valley, if you talk to the common man on the street, uh, they will make no bones about it being a religious battle, and they being a foot soldier in that battle. So similarly, the other side, which is the Hindu side, should also look at it as a religious battle, look at it as a battle of a clash of civilizations, and appeal to their gods and goddesses, our gods and goddesses, in whatever way we can, right? Depending on our own capabilities, and seek divine intervention. And perhaps a lot of people may find it weird because we've moved on from, we've become too rational and too scientific. But that's essentially what the battle is for me as an insider. And I think that as an individual, seeking divine intervention is a very, very potent tool that we have, and a very sensible strategy to assume as far as Kashmir is concerned.
Shifting subjects now, Ashish ji. One of the most unfortunate realities of our times, be it in politics or the larger public discourse in India, is the issue around minorityism. Now, I feel it not only prevents us from calling a spade, but also in very tangible terms, undermines any corrective action that we might want to take in the larger interest of our civilization. Uh, how problematic do you think is the discourse around minorityism? And in your view, how would you, look at this?
Oh, it's absolutely problematic, and it's one of the biggest problems that we are currently facing as a polity. Minorityism itself is um, you could say it's a universalization of the European experience with religious minorities. Right? And one of the videos that we did on this minority issue, we spoke about the Conference of Vienna, which is where this whole minority majority distinction became formalized, which was basically the idea of the conference was to discuss how do you handle the Jews and how do you protect them from the attacks by the Christians, right? Because Jews were a religious minority in Europe and they were surrounded from all sides by Christians of various denominations. Um, and that because of colonialism and because we were a colony of one of the European powers, um, that whole paradigm got shifted and imposed on us lock, stock, and barrel. What the European experience is simply one of the cases of a majority minority divide, right? It's the Christian on one side and the Jew on the other side. But there are various permutations, combinations that can happen, right? So you could have a Christian majority with a Muslim minority, you could have a Jewish majority with a Muslim minority, you could have a Muslim majority with a Christian minority, you could have a Muslim majority with a Jewish minority. Uh, Actually, the last one may not even never see the light. It may never see the light of the day. But so what I'm trying to get at is that there are so many combinations and so many different scenarios, right? Just within these Semitic religions, right? And there is just the distinction between the minoritism that we see in India is only and only a direct transposition of the Jewish and Christian idea, that distinction. And we have completely, disregarded that we are actually a non-Semitic civilization. We are a majority that has nothing to do with the Semitic religions. We are closer to a pagan kind of society. And so this unfamiliar terrain is not acknowledged. No one will say that, okay, we don't know enough about Hinduism or how Hindus live or the so-called plurality that the Hindu society embodies. None of that is discussed, but this framework of minority and majority is just imposed on us. The other thing about the other problem about the about minorityism is the fact that we are actually, I mean, in this globalized world, we are Hindus are a global minority, and the others are in fact a global majority, right? So what that means for us as a people, especially in the modern times, is that uh, and why is it relevant in the modern times is because we are seeing a breakdown of uh, nationalism generally. Nationalism is a bad word in the West, right? And institutions which are inclined or which are associated with nationalism, like the nation state, are also weakening. And you can see a clear example of that in how the Indian state handles protests like the Shaheen Bagh protest or the farmer protest, right? Just yesterday, we were discussing that we had to go to Sonipat and there was no way to take the direct route. We still, I mean, after 1.5 years, right? No, it's been just less than 1 year, I think. Yeah, this has been so many months and a tragic pandemic in between where so many people died, and these guys are still there. right? No one has moved from there, and the Indian state is helpless because of various things, right? I'm not getting into that. What I'm trying to say is that the structure of the nation state has weakened, and the world has become more like a singular unit, a monolith. And in such a situation, one must one must ask who is the real minority, right? So that's the other aspect of the problem, that you are talking about minorities only in the national context, while the world has moved on to a globalized world order, right? The third thing is the fact of that we live in modern times, and modernity with it and the institutions of modernity break down communities, right? And that is more so in a post-colonial state like India. And we, as the majority, have been at the receiving end of colonialism, and now we are at the receiving end of what they call democratic totalitarianism, because now you are a society where communities have broken down, and people do not associate themselves with the community, and they've been made dependent on the state, almost like they are they're addicted to a certain drug. Like when someone is a drug addict, usko aur kuch nahi dikhai deta. There's only the drug which will help them. So similarly, for any solutions, you have to look towards the state. And in such a situation where there is no community, it is easy for all kinds of vested interests, whether they are political in nature, whether they are religious, whether they are civilizational, whether they are commercial, whether they are artistic, what have you. All kinds of interests have this tendency to manipulate the society. And that's what you would call a social engineering kind of project. Social engineering in the service of vested interests, not in the service of some great future, although everyone sells it that way. So in such a scenario where you are basically at the mercy of these impersonal and hostile forces trying to use you for their own vested interests, that is what the minority card becomes. The minority card is that it is blaming you for a failure that is theirs, blaming you for atrocities that they committed, and blaming you for things that you have not even participated in your dreams. So you are, by default, you are a defaulter, and the other guy is the judge. So that's the third aspect, which is the most complicated but the most insidious, which a lot of people don't pay attention to.
Another very important topic that I would like to discuss with you is the state control of Hindu temples. Now, at Upward, you have very strongly advocated for the need to free Hindu temples from state control. Can you please tell us how the Indian state has very systematically denied the Hindus from having a vibrant temple ecosystem?
Right. So the temple takeover is absolutely the most disgusting thing that any government could do. Right. They have no business to meddle in religious affairs, and so they've done some legal, sort of innovations and some trickery to get into this sacred institution of temples. Um, this is wrong at so many levels. Even if we look at, I am a complete anti-secularist, but the temple takeover is an anti-secular act itself, right? You can't meddle in the affairs in the religious affairs of the community. It's against the very basic freedom of practicing your religion. Right? The state should have nothing to do with it. Right? The other thing is that it is anti-community, right? It disempowers and infantilizes the Hindu community. It tells us that we are not capable of managing our own affairs. It's like the state coming to your house and telling you that you can't raise your own kids and we know better, right? It breeds corruption. Uh, we know of all kinds of silly practices like these queues that are arranged according to how much money you can pay. That is not something that happened by the will of the community. That happened because the state wanted to maximize its revenue through the temples. So all kinds of stuff that goes on. And in cases of temples like the Tiruchendur temple, there is blatant corruption going on. There's just no explanation for swindling of lakhs and crores of rupees. Uh, and so that's one problem. Then there is the problem of commercialization of pilgrimage. Uh, it is often sold as, when the state takes up a project with a certain temple, let's say renovation of a temple, um, it often destroys the heritage of the temple, but says that we are modernizing it, right? How does it destroy? Because it has no interest in, or neither interest nor the expertise. They could always hire expertise, but they don't, because it's like, it's just a business thing for them. It's a money making machine for them. So you have temples like, I visited a temple in Nagarkoil, which is in the south of India, where it's a 1,000-year-old temple of uh, Mahavishnu, where they have uh, where they've in the under the pretext of cleaning the temple walls, they've destroyed all the sacred art by sandblasting it. So that's the kind of stuff that the state does. So there is destruction of heritage, there is commercialization of pilgrimage, and making these temples into picnic spots as opposed to sacred spaces. And there is a very insidious tendency of democratization of tradition, which is not democratization is not a positive word in this context, because what it does is that it strips off all authority from the tradition, and uh, and hands it over to arbitrary state agents, like the executive officer appointed by the state, who is some low level bureaucrat, is given the charge of managing the affairs of the temple, which traditionally have been in the hands of a specialized community, which has over generations learnt the art of keeping the deity happy. That's the whole purpose of a temple, right? The temple is meant to house the deity. In fact, the temple is the deity, and the whole tamjham around temple is to keep the deity in good humor. You please the deity so that, one, that itself is a merit that you earn, and secondly, if there's a transaction involved, right? If you are going there to pray, the deity is happy and grants you your wish. So, in simplistic terms, that's how you see the temple. But now, with the state in charge, a secular state at that, which does not believe in the existence of the deity, is is actually managing this as, as some sort of dead asset which needs to be commercialized. So that's how this thing is going on. There are all sorts of pseudo reformist projects which they initiate. They distort the meaning of jatis that have been associated with the temples. They bring in this oppressive narrative, um, and they politicize everything from the appointment of priests, for example, to who will manage the administration, who will sell flowers. All these things have evolved organically over time, and now the state is meddling poking its nose in these affairs, which it has no business of doing. And last but not the least, the impact on ecology, right? The temples have for thousands of years have had their own, the larger temples at least have had their own sacred groves, huge tracts of land uh, where trees and they're forests in their own right. And with the state coming in, they have taken these lands away, grabbed the land, and commercialized it. Buildings have been put over those sacred groves. All kinds of commercial projects have started, and this sort of bullying has happened of the Hindu communities, and no one has raised a voice so far. Uh, of course, there have been so many stalwarts who've who played their part, but I'm generally speaking of the apathy of the Hindu society at large. Hopefully, that is going to change, and hopefully, I mean, I'm optimistic about the Free Temples movement bringing some change in the near future. But that's how the state of the things has been. So the state has no business of being in control of the temples, and it is a demeaning and it's an insulting act by the Indian state that it thinks that it should be there as opposed to the traditional stakeholders or the communities.
Could you also share about why freeing Hindu temples is so critical for the well-being and survival of our civilization, especially in the coming decades? And what sort of a positive impact can freeing Hindu temples bring about in our society?
At the most basic level, it is absolutely critical for us to take back control of our temples, um, because the psychological empowerment of the communities itself is a goal to aspire for. But that aside, I think there are tangible and more material things that we will gain out of getting back temples from the state control. One is, of course, the fact that we are, we will get back our rights, right? The second is that it will empower our communities, the communities that have been traditionally associated with temples. And these are not just Brahmin communities or upper caste. Across all sections of the Hindu society, temples have been nerve centers of the Hindu society, and uh, they have provided opportunities uh, for for revenue generation, for employment, for occupation to many communities and many jatis all over India, and that is something that we need to get back. What has happened, especially with the so-called scheduled caste, scheduled lower caste communities, is that they've been made again dependent on the state. The state has thrown them crumbs of reservation, and they've been insulted, and their existence has been demeaned, and they've been made to feel victimized, and so they have lost all pride in their own identity, and so the state benefits from that, the political parties benefit from that, and so these communities, once they get back some degree of control over the most sacred institution, the most central institution of Hindu society, the sense of belongingness itself is a great boon. Uh, Other than that, of course, there's the temples. Once they're freed, they should be used for dharma prachar, for propagation of Hinduism in its various forms and shapes and colors. In important things like the cow protection, Go Seva, Go Raksha, all this should be the under the aegis of the temples. Uh, the temples should, like in earlier times, have their own akhadas, gymnasiums. They should be centers for cultural revival. All kinds of art forms have originated in the temple, and I think that's the right place for them to further evolve. Um, and most importantly, they put us back in touch with the gods. They give us the responsibility of taking care of our gods, of doing seva of our gods, and to please them, so that they may bless us. Right now, we have outsourced this to the state. So no, I mean, you can always fool humans, but you can't fool the devas. They know what's going on. So if you don't have this, what you would call the samarth to do uh, the seva of the devata can see it, and so that blessing itself is, even if you do it just for that blessing, I think that itself is a goal good enough for striving for freedom of Hindu temples. And
Absolutely.
yeah, and one more point, of course, I mentioned of preserving ecology and heritage. I mean, things like what go on in the temple in the name of cleaning and renovation, that has to stop. So it has to come back to the right stakeholders who know what these things stand for.
One of the things that you mentioned, Ashish ji, is how pride among various Hindu communities has been systematically eroded. And my next question to you actually relates to this. I think this is a subject that doesn't get talked about often, but you have written an article about this in Pragyata, and that is about the contributions of Shudras in our civilization. Now, in today's world, whenever you talk about Shudras, the very word itself tends to attract a lot of negative connotations, and people assume all sorts of things in their mind. But if we look at the history of our civilization, I believe Shudras have played such a critical role in not only helping the civilization survive but also thrive. Can you please share your thoughts on this?
Absolutely. I mean, Shudras have played a glorious role in as artists and artisans and all sorts of skills and manufacturing. I mean, the whole range of material activity, what you would call manufacturing in the current, current times. All that was under the, broadly under the umbrella of Shudras, right? And the Shudras have built the great temples that we were just talking about, right? They were the primary, the designers, the architects, the artisans, the sculptors, the carpenters, right? So so there is no denial. There is absolutely no sense in denying them the glory of what their ancestors were, involved with. So the thing is that they were always a proud people, that is the Shudras, uh, and they had all the reasons to be proud. Uh, they had their own system of education, and these days people say, oh, they were denied Vedic education. They were not denied Vedic education. They had nothing to do with Vedic education. We are talking about a pre-industrial era, right? So Vedic education is a very specialized form of education. Um, it takes almost a decade for someone to be well versed with the Veda, कि कंठस्थ भी हो जाए, बोलना भी, उच्चारण भी important है, and to have the knowledge of the Vyakaran, the Vedangas, the to have access to, I mean, to have read all the commentaries by the great acharyas. So all that is Vedic education, and it takes a long time, right? It takes almost a decade or more than that for higher caliber acharyas. Similarly, in parallel, the Shudras had their own education, right? So the for example, the 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 people who designed and built the Brihadishwara temple, for example, it's an architectural marvel. Uh, do, do you think any reasonable, any sane person would believe that this is the work of some unpada, illiterate person?
Right.
So they had their own rigorous system of education through which they were trained in various arts and craftsmanship, and things like architecture. They knew mathematics. They even knew Sanskrit, right? So the article that you mentioned, we've also provided inscriptional evidence from one of the great works by Vijay Ramaswamy, uh, where they've written in Sanskrit, right? So all that points to the glory of the Shudras only. And given that situation where you are going through a rigorous 10-year education in parallel with the Brahmanas, how will you suddenly switch course and start all over again and become a Vedacharya? So I mean, in that era there was no mobility, occupational mobility. You didn't, your father didn't tell you, beta तुम्हें क्या बनना है, doctor बनना है, engineer बनना है. You did what your father did, and that was as true for the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas, as the Shudras, right? So given that lack of choice, you had your own education system. So this whole business of being denied, and it's all ignorance, and more than ignorance, it's systematic propaganda. Why systematic propaganda? Because again, it goes back to the fact that we are a post-colonial society, and there was a period of colonization. And in colonization, I don't just mean the British rule, but also the Middle Eastern colonization that happened. where a lot of turmoil took place, and the traditional institutions uh, were broken. The continuity of the traditions were broken. There was pressure to convert, like in Kashmir, right? Uh, so all that happened. So many people died. There was a centuries of genocide which happened. So in those circumstances, there was a lot of misery, right? And often these communities, which were living in relative harmony, they turned hostile to each other, right? It could be anyone. It need not necessarily be upper versus lower. It could be lower caste versus lower caste, so called. I don't believe in this hierarchy, but I'm just using the common parlance. So this Shudra versus Shudra community also happened, right? And I could go on and on. For example, when we wrote the Shudra article, there were people who said that no, you have talked about Shudras because they are Savarnas. What about Avarnas? There is much to be said about Avarnas as well, and perhaps we'll soon write about them also. For example, how the Charamkars, the Chamars, how they fell on bad days, right? From the barter system of the Balutadari, where they were taken care of, their families, everything was taken care of. They were even granted lands by the villages that they served. So they were landowners also, contrary to propaganda. To the times when the Britishers introduced industrial production of leather, right? What happened to that entire system where the chamar used to take the dead cow and process it, and in a very organic, using organic material and natural chemicals to process the leather. And then when they introduced chromium tanning, and all sorts of things happened, and then they encouraged cow slaughter, so the whole system got disrupted. And when this miserable time, when we now look back at it, we refer to the colonial sources, and these colonial sources are obviously justifying what they are doing, right? And then we cite those same sources and say that, look, these guys were at each other's throats all the time. That's not true. Any serious reading of it would tell you, any sincere and serious reading of the texts of the records of that era will tell you that this was not the case. That it was not that people were at each other, but they were made to fight each other, not in the sense of a conspiracy theory, but the situation became such that there was fight for small resources, right? Uh, and I'll try to make this brief because there's so much to say. But let's take the case of the chamars again. Normally, the cow dies, the the chamar takes the cow, and then their community is further subdivided. They have their own divisions in which the first person skins the animal, then the other person does the tanning, and the third person makes the footwear or the other stuff from leather, and then there is another community which repairs these things, right? So there is a complex ecosystem which is involved. Suddenly, the British come, and they implement these high taxes, all kinds of stuff. They bring in industrial production of leather, and they encourage cow slaughter. By encouraging cow slaughter, they incentivize the owners of the cows to sell their cows, right? When you sell the cow to the industry, what does the chamar get? Nothing. So who is responsible, right? it's the changed circumstances which were induced by the colonial power that were responsible for this disruption, that left the chamar at the brink of, not on the brink of, but completely powerless and in absolute poverty. So who's responsible? It was the British. But if you say that, they'll say, oh, you blame everything on the British. So that kind of stuff which goes on in the popular discourse, that has to be countered, and that has to be countered with good scholarship, not just sloganeering. Because what is at stake is really a choice between, for the Shudras, the choice between victimhood and self-esteem. And we all know where those two choices lead. If you are choosing victimhood, then you will perpetually remain a victim. and you will perpetuate that victimhood to your next generation, and on and on and on. And that will lead to nothing but disaster for your own community. So that's something that has gone on. And like I mentioned, that the democratic system also is responsible. The modern democracy is also responsible for destroying these communities in its own way and atomizing society and making them prone to manipulation, manipulation of identity, manipulation of history, and ultimately leading to totalitarian control. So corporations have their own role to play in that. The, the corporations, I mean, today also, the kind of conditions in which many of the industries, these, for example, the leather industry, if you look at the average condition of the worker in the leather industry, it is worse than slavery. But no one has the guts or the gumption to point that out because, oh, it's modern industry, and you have the audacity to question a system where everything was in harmony. I'm not saying it was a utopia. There were conflicts, there were all kinds of things, but it was nowhere as bad as how it is today for them. But you're refusing to see the the, the complete mess in front of you because it's so horrible, and you're blaming some event in the past for which actually the people who enslaved you are responsible, but somehow you're internalizing that guilt. That's what is happening, and that is what colonialism and coloniality is all about. So, that it's a circular problem. So now that, I mean, if you bring in corporations to this mix, right, the modern corporations, you will realize that people from these marginalized communities are still being exploited, right? They don't live in great conditions, right? Which is why you have this whole Marxist and communist movement, and the labor unions and stuff. And there is a lot of propaganda happening from both sides. From the side of the capitalists who say that no, this is trickle down, we will make money, money will go to everyone. And there are communists who will say no, we need revolution and we need to break down everything. But they're basically working in the same framework, right? And they're fighting each other. It's just a dialectic that they are engaged in. Whereas the traditional system of organization, which was community based, had a lot more wisdom. It was not perfect, but it took care of its people. If you go to a leather processing shop today in Kanpur or Bangladesh, you will find people working in abysmal conditions, in toxic conditions, right? And no one questions that because it's a modern industry. But today, where we are, when we are questioning the choices made by unknown people from 200 years back, without even bothering to, understand the circumstances that led to those choices, uh, people, I mean, we are answerable to posterity, and the coming generations will question us. That no one seems to realize in the popular discourse. So I think, I mean, the choice is clear, and we have to, the choice between victimhood and self-esteem is clear, and depending on what they choose, that will determine the future of a large section of India's population and the course of the country itself.
Absolutely, Ashishji. I think the discourse has to be corrected. It has to be seen in the, I mean, it has to be read properly. I think, like you said, there's a lot of need for scholarship also that focuses on these topics because so much has been distorted, especially because of the British sort of interventions in the whole systems.
No,
And like you
also the
said,
scholarship. I mean, the need for scholarship is there, has been there, was always
right,
there.
right,
The problem is that the scholarship has been hijacked by an ideological group, which
right,
is the Marxists, and they will not allow dissent, right? And so you have tomes and tomes of false scholarship
right.
being churned out, which repeats the same lie, and that repeating the same lie is classic propaganda.
Before I conclude this, Ashish ji, I would also like to ask you a few recommendations, especially for young Hindus. What are some of the books, authors, thinkers that you would like to recommend for young Hindus in order to for them to truly understand our civilization well? What would your suggestions be?
Right. So actually, it depends on their own interest, which which field of study they would like to pursue first, and later how they want to prioritize. But if I were to just say, speak out some names from the top of my head, uh, I think reading Sri Aurobindo is is a is a profound blessing, and the clarity and the depth of his writings are something to be admired and to learn from. Uh, the works of Swami Vivekananda are very inspiring, and especially the ideas around yoga and the overall, I mean, a very bird's eye view of the Hindu religion and its connect with the Indian civilization. What is Hindu nationalism? I think all that is you can glean from that. Mm, for the more literary minded, for the more artistically inclined, I think Anand Kumaraswamy is a great author, very profound, very sharp and pointed. Um, from the from modern India, I think any book from Voice of India, and I think um, if you don't read any of the other things I said, at least read the Voice of India, the books from Voice of India, all kinds of the great authors like Sitaram Goyal, Ram Swarup, Conrad Hales. These are names that most of your viewers may be familiar with. And I think that it's very important to read their works directly, as opposed to just reading about them or watching their videos. Uh, then, of course, the classics, Mahabharata, Mahabharata hai, Ramayana hai, they will never run out of fashion. They are always there. If you want to go further, you could read the Upanishads for a more philosophical take on dharma. The Puranas for a very wider understanding of all kinds of stuff, including the gods, morality, what have you. So that's basically as far as the Indian part is concerned. I have found a lot of insights in the writings of authors from the European New Right. Uh, People like Oswald Spengler and Nietzsche, and from the contemporary sources, there's um, Alain de Benoit. So these are writers that write very piercingly about the problems of today's polity, today's uh, Eurocentric world, and they also write about paganism from a very European perspective. So it's very insightful in that sense that here's someone born in a Christian land talking about pagan practices, and you clearly see the parallels and you see the threats because they're speaking from the point of view where paganism has disappeared. So that's another set of authors that I find very useful, and perhaps the viewers will also. I think I'll stop there.
And I see a guitar in your background, but I don't see a lot of videos where you perform those very interesting, songs on the guitar. So when can we see those, and when can we expect to see those?
Yeah, a lot of people have asked me. I mean, they were quite popular, the songs. Unfortunately, at that time it was easier to write those songs because you were basically criticizing the people who were defeated already. I wrote those songs in 15-16, where the NDA government had already come to power. It was a moment of victory for us because I had voted for them. And the enemy was the target of ridicule. But now we've come along. And now if I turn my guns against the people I voted, that somehow doesn't I don't get that inner calling. So So that's the reason that not much has happened. But also because there's so much going on. And jokes apart, there's just so much going on that I don't get time to sit and think about songs. That's sad for me also. But yeah, I mean, can't help it. But if I get a window of time, I mean some brief respite, I'll certainly make a song, some fun song, and perhaps it will offend a few friends also. But उसका मतलब ही वो है. Satire is meant to offend. So yeah.
Absolutely. I'm sure a lot of people would love to see that, no matter what the topic is. I think those songs are really brilliant, and I mean they're super entertaining. But at the same time, they make the point that you wanted to make very creatively, and we hope that you resume them at some stage, like you said. Thank you, Ashish ji. It has been an absolute pleasure to have you on our platform.
Well, thank you. I should thank you for giving me the opportunity and for listening to me patiently. I don't know if I meandered into all kinds of topics, and sometimes it may have bored you, but I hope that at least some of it was useful and specifically for your viewers. And thank you for the opportunity again.
And I would encourage our viewers to please follow Ashish ji and the brilliant work that he has been doing. With that, it's a wrap on this conversation, but we will be back with another such thought-provoking conversation. But viewers, please do subscribe to our channels, both the Festival of Bharat and Chitti Media, because we'll, as you know, be posting content of both of them. Do share our videos so that you amplify our voice, and we'll see you next time. Until then, take care. Namaste.
Namaste. We hope you enjoyed this Chitti Media content. Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.